Okay, I think we're there. We're there. So lights are out. We're going to get started here. So thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Glenn Corbett. I'm the president of the Paterson Museum Foundation, who's sponsoring these webinars. The Paterson Museum Foundation dates back to about 2017 as a 501c3 nonprofit that assists the Paterson Museum in a variety of ways. We help conserve objects. We've bought a few objects for the museum. Programming, we've helped with that. Photography issues, digital scanning of negatives. And more recently, we're excited to announce that we're involved being a conduit to create a canopy shed over the two locomotives that are outside the building everyone's familiar with. So there's a lot of good things happening. And again, it's through the Paterson Museum Foundation and working with the wonderful people like Jack here, that we're able to accomplish a lot of these things. And we appreciate you being here tonight, because this is one of the things we've been looking to do for a while. And as we all know, COVID sort of changed our lives quite a bit. And maybe one of the good things that came out of it is all these now wonderful webinars at historical societies and organizations across the country. So we have our little piece of that. And I'd like to mention specifically what those pieces are. So tonight is a second lecture we call our speaker series. So tonight, of course, I'll be talking about the Great Paterson Fire. Going forward in January, we actually we're fortunate to have Jim Rassenberger, who is the author of the relatively new book that came out during COVID called Revolver. It's the new Sam Colt biography. And I'm excited to have, we're all excited to have him on board, because he'll be talking about particularly Sam's early life, which he's uncovered a lot of new information, and particularly his involvement with Paterson and Roswell Colt, his cousin, to build his very first gun mill that many of you know. So we're looking forward to having him, and he'll be here on January 18th, next month. On February 15th, our own Heather Garside, who's the curator at the Paterson Museum, works with Jack. She'll be giving a PowerPoint lecture called Can't Discriminate Against Negroes, the Minerva Miller Story. It's sort of an unknown story about an important African-American and early 20th century Paterson, dealing with issues of admittance and, of course, segregation and things like that. So we're looking forward to that. And again, that'll be February 15th. Our other series that we're running right now, we're very excited about as well. We have Ed Smike, the Passaic County historian. He's a walking encyclopedia of Paterson and Passaic County. I don't think there's anybody on the planet that knows more about our area than he does. And he has his own series we're calling Stories Behind the Stories, Stories Behind the Story, Chats with Passaic County historian Ed Smike. He did one last week on the Dimension. That was sort of part one. He'll be doing the Dimension part 2 on January 13th. Then he and I will come back on January 27th to talk about another individual of fame and fortune, and maybe not so much a sustained fortune, but maybe fortune in Paterson, Timothy Crane. Timothy Crane, perhaps you might recognize the name. The Crane name is a lot of the Crane family in North Jersey, but he was important to Paterson because, of course, he built the very first bridge across the Passaic Falls, and created what they called a pleasure garden. And related to tonight, he was Paterson's very first fire chief in the volunteer department. So Ed and I will be talking about him, and that will be on January 27th. So if you're at all interested in attending any of these, the same email address that you sent to get into this one tonight, you'll use. All of these are being recorded and will be posted to YouTube within a week or two after the actual event. So if you missed one or you'd like to see it again, the YouTube channel for the Paterson Museum will contain all of these. So I got a few more announcements. So let me bring in Jack Stefano just to say hello and introduce himself.
Good evening, everyone. Yeah, I'm Jack Stefano, the director of the Paterson Museum. Glenn's been assisting us for a number of years, and actually we celebrated the 100th anniversary, or commemorated the 100th anniversary of the Great Fire, and he served actually as our curator as well as our chief advisor. So, and being part of the foundation, we're looking at a very bright future. Thank you, Dave and Glenn and everyone else who's listening. Participate.
Thank you. Yeah, we're all excited about this. This is great stuff. We can reach all around the world now, okay, from #2 Market Street. So that's a really good thing. Tonight, if you feel so inclined, if you'd like, in the chat room, I've placed a link to the Patterson Museum's Foundation's PayPal account. So if you'd like to make a donation, it's totally up to you. How much you give, or if you give it all, it's there for you to use. Again, we're a nonprofit, so you can put that on your taxes as well. At the end of tonight's presentation, we'll have some Q&A. So think about any questions you might have that come up during the presentation, and we'll answer them all at the end. You can type those also in the chat box if you like. And then when I stop sharing screen, I'll go to those and we'll go through them one at a time to see if you have, again, any questions or comments, perhaps maybe recollections of a family member that told you about the fire. So let's do that. So without further ado, let's jump right into the presentation tonight. So this is, as Jack mentioned, 20 years ago, we had the fire commemoration at 5 different sites in the city. We actually had the Patterson Museum focused a lot on the fire department, the city piece of the puzzle. Passaic County Historical Society looked at the fire in general, sort of like a broader brush, basically up at Lambert Castle. The Courthouse House played a role, because you hear tonight, many people don't know about sort of the issues of labor and the anarchist movement that was it was happening at the same time as the fire. And they had their own displays there. The Hamilton Club, as you know, that building, many of you know the building, that is now owned by the Passaic County Community College, and they had an exhibit. And then finally, the library, the Patterson Library, which was one of the gems that came out of the fire that we'll talk a little bit about later. They had their own exhibit, and we had lectures and things. I think it really came together very well. And like I said, it's hard to believe it was 20 years ago when that happened. So this is the story of the Great Paterson Fire. It is, in fact, I did the research, it is, in fact, New Jersey's largest fire in terms of size. So there was a fire 2 years earlier in Hoboken that unfortunately killed over 300 people on a couple of German ocean liners, basically, that were docked in Hoboken. A fire spread from the piers onto the ships. They pulled the ships away from the piers, and unfortunately, people were trapped below deck, and many of them perished in that fire. So that is the largest number of fatalities in terms of size in the state. But this one was the largest in terms of its physical size, how much area it took up. Just a little background. So on me, maybe some of it I perhaps don't know. So my day job is a John Jay College professor of fire science and public management. That's my day job. I've got a few sort of 1099s as well. I work with Fire Engineering Magazine, which actually reported on the Paterson Fire. It's one of the country's oldest trade journals, 145 years old this year. And it's actually based in Fair Lawn. Nobody knows here, but it's in Fair Lawn across what used to be Nabisco, basically. That's where that magazine is developed. And I spent a lot of time in code enforcement. So I spent 10 years working for the Austin, the later San Antonio fire departments as a code official. And so that's sort of part of my background. I've been a fireman for many years. I was assistant chief in Waldwick, where I live now. And I was actually an auxiliary fireman in Patterson, engine 9. That doesn't exist anymore. It's now engine 6 down on Getty Ave. So fire's been my life for a while. And of course, knowing about this fire always intrigued me and to know more about it. And so I set out to actually write a book about it, which I was able to do. It was self-published, and sort of tell the story. And again, working with Jack and the other institutions, we pulled off I think a great series of displays and lectures on all sorts of different things related to the fire. So the book was sort of the starting point. And so that's where this came from. This PowerPoint actually comes from back then when we did it 20 years ago. So, but the story, of course, doesn't change, right? So talk about Patterson itself, the city. We think of Patterson today as sort of like, okay, 150,000 people roughly, pretty ethnically diverse, right? The years leading up to the fire, it's hard to believe this, but between the years 1880 and 1900, Paterson doubled in population from about 50,000 to 100,000 in 20 years. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine the need for housing and stuff? Because of course, you know, as many of you know, Paterson, of course, started as a cotton town to a certain extent. It's not till the late 1830s that silk first comes through with Christopher Colt and his floor on the gun mill. And of course, the locomotives and machine shops that really were the base of Paterson for so many years. Silk really starts to take off toward the end of the 20th century, or excuse me, end of the 19th century. And so it's not just silk production, it's making different types of silk, but it's also the dyeing industry, right? So coloring of silk and things, massive amounts of work going on then. And so they needed people to work in the mills, right? From beginning to end, basically. And that's how the city was such an attractive place to go, because there were plenty of jobs for people to have. So again, it was a city on the rise, basically, in terms of population, in terms of wealth. Let me take a step back. So in terms of population, it's hard to believe also that Paterson was at one time the 32nd largest city in the country. Hard to believe that, but again, that was all, again, around this time that we're talking about now. As many of you know, the Paterson itself, the city of Paterson came out of the development through the Society for Establishing Usual Manufacturers, the SUM, of Hamilton fame and L'Enfant fame and Colt fame. That was the beginning of Paterson, and that started in July of 1792. Well, guess what? In July of 1892, the city of Paterson put on this extravagant centennial celebration across the city, and perhaps the most important element of that celebration was the building you're looking at right now, which is the City Hall that we still know to this day. It was the crowning jewel. It didn't start out that way. There was I found some plans from Colonel Durham, who is still alive at this point. He wanted to build actually a big stadium out of wood, and that fortunately didn't happen. So he was a carpenter, of course, by trade. We never got the stadium, but we did get the City Hall. So that is again, a marker for what was going on at the turn of the century. So you got a city that's roughly 100,000 people. 36% of the people in the city are foreign born, okay, which we check it today. That might not be that much different today. Foreign born. Again, a variety of ethnicities. We see the very early folks in South Paterson, again, involved with the dyeing industry, silk dyeing, coming from places like Syria and Jordan. So it is a melting pot even back then, over 120 years ago. It's a place where there's plenty of wealth. It's a center for New Jersey and North Jersey's commerce, right? So if you lived any of the surrounding communities in Bergen or Passaic County, Paterson was the place you went to, because of course all the rail lines went there, the trolley lines went there. It was a place you shopped. It was a place you did all your business for the most part, and perhaps even doctors and things like that, right? So we had the Paterson General Hospital, which was the regional hospital at the time. And so again, Paterson was a centerpiece for a lot of different things. And again, so shopping, some of you remember the old Quackenbush store. This is what it looked like before the fire, okay? It's nice. It's a wonderful, beautiful building, but it's not, of course, the massive building that came out after it. By the way, you notice all those electrical lines in the photograph. The reason for that, that's the telephone company right next door to it. And all those telephones go into that building. And telephones, we'll find out later on, played a critical role in the fire. So there's Quackenbush. Of course, that's right on Main Street. Scheuer across the street over there, again, just showing different kinds of commercial operations, right? There's my phone. Hold on, sorry, I started to mute it already. Here we go. Sorry about that. Okay, this is, to me, the absolute, I think, the most attractive building in the city at the time. This was the First National Bank. It was behind City Hall, right? So it's basically on Ellison Street, corner Washington. So you're looking at the corner Washington, Ellison. The City Hall would be to your right and behind you, sort of. I want to show you a couple other things in this photograph. Just to the far left, if you look there, you'll see, like you see the church steeple. That's the First Baptist Church, which we're going to hear about. That steeple played a role in the fire as well. But that building sort of in front of it, between the First National Bank with that wonderful and if you notice the two statues on the third floor there, there's a chimney there. That is Paterson's original city hall, which it turned out was the home of Peter Colt. Peter was the Colt family patriarch who came to Paterson at the behest of the SUM, and of course he knew Hamilton, and he's the guy who got the very first mill going, the very first raceway going. That was his house. And actually, when he lived in it, it was only 2 stories high. And so when the city ended up buying it basically to use as a city hall, they added an additional floor underneath, so it became a 3-story building. And later on, when we look at some of the ruins, you'll see that those chimneys there. So I just want to point it out to you what it looked like beforehand. There's the Second National Bank, another beautiful building, which is still there to this day. There are 5 survivors of the Paterson fire in the fire area. We just saw 2 of them, City Hall and this building, okay? This building exists on the corner of Colt Street and Market. And what's most notable about it, they took that incredibly beautiful mansard roof off years later, like I think in the 40s, I think they took it down. And anyway, but that building is still there to this day. There's the Paterson National Bank building. This is a cross Market diagonally from City Hall going to the east. What's notable about that building is that the famed Paterson historian William Nelson had his offices in there. And William Nelson, who wrote so many things about Paterson and books and what have you, a large portion of his really relic and ephemera collection were burnt up in the fire in that building. Fortunately, some of his stuff he had taken home to work on, and thank God he did, because that's his stuff that survived. The stuff that was in the building was destroyed in the fire. This is the corner of Market and Church Streets, and of course, if you were there today, you'd be looking at that particular corner. You'd be looking at the Alexander Hamilton Hotel, which came years later. This was the city's public library. A little fun fact about Paterson: Paterson had the very first in the state, first free public library. We were the first in the 1880s. And so they needed a building, and along comes I can't think of her first name now. The Danforth family comes forward and says, "Hey, would you like our house at the corner of Market and Church that Charlie Danforth, the famed locomotive man and machine man, his daughter donated the property and the building?" And so that was the library. Now, this photo is a few years before the fire, because there was actually an addition put on to the left-hand side of that picture that also went up in the fire, basically. So this building was destroyed, and we'll hear about its replacement later on. One last point about this: in that arched entryway were 2 famous statues that Roswell Colt had in his mansion, which is where the Passaic County Administration, Courthouse, all that area up there was a gigantic hill at the time. And Roswell had his mansion up there, and he had 2 sandstone statues that eventually worked their way into this library, and they also were never seen again. I've looked at every photograph of the fire at that corner, and I cannot see even an arm or a leg sticking out. So I know somebody took them. They're kind of heavy, so I don't think that's the case, but sandstone does not do well in fire, as does not certain types of limestone, particularly the ones in City Hall. So we'll see that. Oh, here's the statues. Here they are. Now, did somebody walk off with those? We don't know. No one ever mentioned finding them in the rubble, even the heads or any pieces of them. So we have no idea where they went, but there they were in the entryway in the library, having been moved from Roswell Colt's mansion up on the hill there down to the library a few years later. Here's a place that some of you might know as Sandy Hill Park, now known as Roberto Clemente Park, along Market Street, off downtown in the Sandy Hill area. Now, reason I show you this photo because it's critical to the extinguishment of this fire. Thank God for cemeteries, okay? Because this cemetery and the Presbyterian cemetery, the Methodist cemetery, the Catholic cemeteries, which were all in this area here. I mean, some of you who grew up in Paterson who went to East Side High School know that, of course, the mascot is the ghost because it's built on a cemetery that's across the street from this. So this is one of the many cemeteries that were being emptied out, you know, in the 1870s, 1880s, into the 20th century, because the city wanted to take this land and use it for development. And of course, that meant that all the bodies that were buried there had to be moved to Cedar Lawn, Holy Sepulchre, or wherever they were going to go. So I'm sure there's still, unfortunately, still people out there under Sandy Hill Park right now and under East Side High School. When I used to mow my grandparents' lawn on 38th Street, every once in a while, I get a nice piece of polished marble that would come up out of the ground, basically, because I'm guessing that their property was used, there was fill from this area that was dumped there. And that's what my grandparents told me. That's where they had filled in certain areas on the east side there with land that soil that came from here. So, but this plays a critical role. So keep that in mind. Here's a looking guy, Mayor Hinchcliffe. Okay, not the Hinchcliffe after Hinchcliffe Stadium. That was his nephew. Also another mayor of Paterson. This is John Hinchcliffe, who owned, with his two brothers, the Hinchcliffe Brewery. And he was, for all intents and purposes, he was the kind of guy you wanted in charge when something really bad happens, like a disaster, like the fire. And we'll hear about him later on a little bit more. But he was, he in my mind, I would put Mayor Kramer, who I think is on this call tonight, who's one of our board members. I put the two of them together as perhaps Paterson's most famous and really helpful mayors that they've had its entire history. I mean, there's certainly others, but again, I think of Mayor Kramer the same way I think about this guy, and we'll see a cartoon of him in a little while, what he did. But the fire department, we're talking about this conflagration. And by the way, a conflagration by definition is basically essentially an uncontrollable fire that has certain characteristics. And, you know, national groups point to wind, sometimes temperature, but the most important one is the ability for the fire to jump natural barriers, meaning streets, rivers, railroad tracks, to essentially go beyond the building or buildings involved and spread much more quickly across the landscape, basically. And, you know, the period that we're talking about, 1902, is the very center of the American conflagration period. So you get, if you want to bookmark it, generally speaking, from the Great Chicago Fire in 1871, in October 71, that's why Fire Prevention Week is every week is the same as the week of the fire in Chicago, up to and just past the Great San Francisco earthquake and fire, 1906. If you look at the majority of conflagrations in America, they all tend to be in that same time period. See, you can look at most major cities: Seattle, Atlanta, Georgia, Los Angeles. I mean, you go through, and of course, again, I mentioned Chicago and some of the big cities, particularly in the Northeast. They all had their conflagrations, and Paterson's again came in 1902. What did the fire department look like? Well, here's the dudes in charge of the fire department. The center is a man by the name of John Stag. John was the first, or actually the second chief of the paid Paterson Fire Department, but he had been a chief in the volunteer department, Civil War veteran, you know, well-known individual. A little piece about him: he eventually became president of the international, actually wasn't called that yet, the National Association of Fire Engineers, the National Association of Fire Engineers. And that is the national group that represents fire chiefs across the country, is now known as the International Association of Fire Chiefs, not engineers. So he was well known, so well known, he was president of that group a few years after the fire. And the unfortunate thing for him was, and again, things like this happen in life, he traveled, I think it was to Grand Rapids, Michigan, for the annual convention. And unfortunately, his wife passed away while they were up there. So it's really sad what happened to his situation not too long after this fire. But he's the guy sitting in the center. Even to this day, the Paterson Fire Department remembers him in the form of a heroism medal that they issue to firefighters. So his name lives on. The two assistant chiefs are the guys on the left and the guy on the right. That's Chief Mills on the left and Chief Gilmore on the right. They also came from the volunteers in early days and basically worked their way up the ranks. And so what's the rest of the fire department look like? Basically 9 engines, 3 ladder companies, a chemical company, and other assorted personnel. But what's really, it's astonishing to people to think about this. There were more firefighters on duty in 1902 than there are tonight in Paterson. Hard to believe that. And there's actually fewer engine companies tonight than there were back then. Now, of course, we're talking an era in 1902 of horse-drawn steam fire engines. That's what the pumpers. The chemical wagon they had was a really smart idea developed about 30 years earlier. We're not sure exactly what place it started, but chemical wagons spread across the country like wildfire, because what they did is they were like gigantic extinguishers on wheels. And so what was good about it was that you could have a soda acid. Some of you might remember the old soda acid extinguishers. That's basically what it was. They mixed sulfuric acid with bicarbonate of soda, which created pressure. That pressure then forced the water out of a hose, and they put it on the fire. Why it's so cool and good was that they could get there really quick. They could just invert the cylinder or move the sulfuric acid into the equation, and they got water quickly. A steam fire engine took a while to get a head of steam up, although they tried to keep it going during days and nights, so they didn't have to take that long. It did take minutes to get the engine going. So the chemical wagon was a way, way, way ahead kind of thought, and it lasted until we got motorized equipment, basically in the 20s and 30s. The chemicals kind of went out. But the Paterson Fire Department, like I said, was a fully paid department. They had started as volunteers essentially in 1815. By 1890, we began the process of converting it to a fully paid department. By 1895, they are in fact a career department as they are today. So firehouses back then tended to be single or perhaps two companies, but they basically spread all the equipment around the city essentially. So there are firehouses not only downtown, but on the then beginning suburban areas around. So the later fire companies after Engine 9, like Engine 10 ended up way out on 17th Avenue and Vreeland Ave, 11 and 12 and 13 ended up on Trenton Avenue. So this was pretty much all around downtown because that's where what was going on was happening, and that's why they were there. So that's what the fire department looked like. Oh, here's their chemical wagon on Hotel Street. There it is. So it's a much smaller piece of apparatus, but again, the efficiency, the quickness of it was what made this so important. So even in my little town of Waldwick, right, we had a chemical wagon because it was like that. You didn't need, if it was a small fire, you could put it out pretty quickly and stuff. So a nice piece of equipment. Okay, well, let's get to the fire itself. The background on the city and the fire department, what have you. So let's talk about the fire itself. So this is a Civil War era photograph of a building called the Wigwam. Okay, the Wigwam was built by Andrew Derham, the same Derham that wanted to build a gigantic stadium instead of City Hall. But Andrew Derham built this for the then brand new Republican political party. And it had various names. You can see on the photograph, it's called Freedom's Temple at that point. But what's notable about it is that Andrew Derham was an expert carpenter. He actually, hard to believe this too, but he actually developed one of the first, perhaps the first prefabricated wood buildings that could be shipped by rail and assembled across the country, basically. So if you're moving to Nebraska or California, he designed prefabricated homes, churches, everything. He had a whole series of these things in the 1870s and 80s. So he's a really expert carpenter. He built this building, of course, without any columns in the center. Columns, from an architectural standpoint, are not desirable, right? From a firefighting standpoint, in the classroom and in my textbook, I always argue that columns are the firefighter's friend. Okay, long spans of beams without columns are not good for firefighters, but this place is not only missing a lot of columns, it was also made entirely of wood. Okay, so you could see what's going on here. By February 8th, 1902, this building is now owned by a trolley company, okay, that's based it goes Paterson, Jersey City, and Hoboken. Okay, Paterson was a center for not just the railroads, but the trolleys that brought people across North Jersey, basically. And this was a trolley barn at that point. There was other buildings around it, but it was essentially being used for storage at that point. So that night, February 8th, what's going on? Well, it's a very cold night. It's a weekend night. It's a very cold night. And, as I mentioned before, wind is a role in conflagrations, okay? So we estimate 40, 50 mile an hour winds are blowing through Paterson. It's super cold out. Most of the people, the area is deserted downtown by midnight because there's nothing going on. Nobody wants to be out in a cold, windy night, right? They don't want to be outside. So there's very few people on the streets at this point. But who is working at that point, though, are watchmen in the trolley barns. And they're the ones who supposedly first see the fire. Now, in researching this fire, I've read just about everything about it that I could find. There is an undated and unattributed document at Rutgers in their library, which blames this fire actually on a bunch of drunken, quote unquote, insurance men that were on Van Houten Street to the left outside. Well, this picture is a little bit earlier, but to the left of this building, they're having a party that night. And the party got out of hand and an oil lamp flew through the window and landed on the roof of this building right here. That's one way it started, supposedly. The other probably more likely scenario is it was that since it was so cold out, a lot of the trolleys came back with their stove still in operation inside the building, and it's probably related to that what started the fire. So the watchman, one of the watchmen, sees the flames in the building, immediately runs to the corner of Main and Broadway, where there's a fire alarm pull box. Remember in the old days, we had telegraph boxes on street corners that you could literally send a message to the fire department by just pulling a lever, which in turn sent a coded signal, electrically, telegraph signal, to fire headquarters and to the firehouses with a number on it. So that number corresponded to the actual number of the fire alarm box. So each fire company had a list of alarm boxes that they went to on the first alarm, the second alarm, the third alarm, what have you. So they see that box come in, and of course, the engine one, which is right up Van Houten Street, is just a couple blocks away. So some of them are very close to this, and they get there pretty quickly. Who also is responding at this point is, in fact, Chief Mills. He's over on Water Street. Now, Water Street, we know today is Presidential Boulevard. I mean, we think of the big high rises over there. The CCP used to be there. We think of that, but at this time in 1902, Water Street is a lot of 3- and 4-story buildings, basically, just like the rest of Main Street looks like. It sort of looks along those lines. And his headquarters is over there in one of the firehouses. So when the box comes in, he basically said Mills came out of the firehouse, and of course, he makes the turn and looks toward this area downtown, and he literally described it as a volcano, okay, is the way he described this thing. Now, he's been a fireman a long time. He knows heavy winds, wood are not a good mix here. And so what he does very quickly is he sends in a third alarm from that same fire alarm box. Those boxes that civilians will call them pull to send the alarm out, you can open the door of that, and there's a telegraph key inside, which they use to communicate to central headquarters, to where things were going on, and tell them transmit the third alarms, which headquarters does. They transmit a third alarm. Within a few more minutes, it's a general alarm. The entire Paterson Fire Department's there because Mills realizes this is really, really bad, and he needs help. Okay, here's the trolley company, Jersey City, Hoboken, and Paterson Street Railway Company. That's a little ticket from their operation. Now, what about Chief Stag? Where is he? Well, he and Gilmore are at home. Okay, hard to think about this, but one of my mentors, Chief William Comer, who passed away several years ago, he was one of my mentors. Hard to believe this, but back in the day, if you were a chief in the fire department, you literally had an alarm gong in your house. Okay, so when the alarms went off with the alarm gongs, can you imagine 3 o'clock in the morning, your private home, your wife and your children hearing this ding, ding, ding all night long and stuff? They just got used to it because that was the place where, because telephones at this point even are still relatively new. But even Chief Comer told me his father had them and stuff. So that lasted for quite a few years. But Chief Stag is home on Van Houten Street. If you were standing at the back side of the library, today's library, stand on the back side along Van Houten Street, look to the right, that next block down, his house is right in there. But what's the problem? What's the problem with poor Chief Stag? He's a famous guy. He's well-known, respected fire officer, not just in Paterson, but across the country. He's at home. He's got pneumonia, okay? He's at home in bed with pneumonia. His wife will not let him leave the house, okay? So what happens is, I am sure he knew exactly what's going on. All he do is look out his front window at an angle down Van Houten Street, and he sees the entire city essentially on fire at this point. And he's thinking, oh my God, what am I gonna do? He plays a critical role here. The critical role is he's got a working telephone and he calls for help, okay? That's a sign of a good chief. Know when you're out resourced, you call for help right away. So he starts off with calling Passaic. He calls, later on, he ends up calling Newark and Jersey City because he realizes they got the heavy equipment, they can come in. Ridgewood shows up. He calls them. They show up with I think they're hose wagon or chemical wagon. I can't remember off the top of my head. They're there, and pretty much Clifton is as we would call them, a self-deployer, right? They see the fire going. They just start out on their own. Now, in today's world in firefighting, that's like a bad thing to do under the National Incident Management System, is to self-deploy. I mean, you just get in your car, your truck, and start going, because you have to be called first, not to just go on your own. But back then, hey, Clifton's, one of their ladder companies showed up, so of course they could help as well. So Stag plays this critical role of getting help moving into the city. Okay, so he's trying to help Gilmore and Mills deal with the fire, because back in those days, guess how many chiefs were in the Paterson Fire Department? 3. That's it. Those 3 guys are it. There's the only other officers in there are captains of the individual, or foremen of the individual companies. That's it. There are no other chiefs. I mean, today's world, when I give classes to firefighters about this kind of stuff, they're shocked, because in today's world, we got a million chiefs for all sorts of stuff, but back then they did not have it. So they really had their hands tied here, and it was a very difficult thing to do. Okay, so there's Mills. Again, Mills is the one who calls in pretty quickly for a general alarm, basically. And so he's trying to manage a fire, and eventually Gilmore shows up to help him. Now, what's going on with the fire? The wind is blowing basically from the west toward the east and toward the south. So again, the fire is heading to the east and to the south. That's the direction the fire is going. Again, starts in the Wigwam. The Wigwam and that trolley complex spans 2 streets, Broadway and Van Houten Street, the backside of both. So there's tenements on Broadway right next door that are occupied. And so there's people in there that need to be evacuated. Their buildings are heavily damaged, but what's so unusual about it is that those edge buildings are only basically, the sides are burnt off. There's no other damage going to the west, okay? It's all driving it toward the east. But unfortunately, one of the people in there is an older woman by the name of Mary Brown. Perhaps her name is Mary Braun. She ended up dying. We don't even know. This is the weirdest part of a lot of the story, is finding out these crazy situations. I used to be going. I go to a meeting in the State Fire Code Council bi-monthly, and we used to meet near Trenton. And so one day when I was doing the research, I said, let me drive over to the State Health Department and see if I can find anything about Mary Brown. So I walked in. I said, hey, look, I want you to look up a fatality, February 9th, 1902, Paterson, New Jersey, Mary Brown. Can you find her? The woman said, come back in an hour. And I did. And she gave me a certified copy of her death certificate. The weird part of it, it's signed by Andrew McBride, the famous Dr. Andrew McBride. But the weird part of it, Jack still can't believe this. There's no cause of death on the death certificate. There's nothing on there. Okay. So she died. That's all he basically said. I could not find her grave. It's up in Mount Nebo. I could not find it. The records aren't good enough back then, and so we didn't find it. Health Department, which only jump ahead for a second here, Health Department lost a lot of their records that night because that was consumed in the fire as well. Now, the state did have some stuff, but I'm sure there's a lot of missing things genealogically speaking because of this fire, because pretty much everything that was in the Health Department, death certificates, weddings, all that kind of stuff, a lot of that was consumed. So anyway, here's poor Chief Mills, the biggest fire New Jersey ever has, and it's on his shoulders right now. So I feel bad for the guy. Because here's a shot of the Wigwam, the other side. This is the Broadway side. You can see it's a little bit different. This is the only known photograph of this building right before the fire. It's not a great image. It's in the Historical Society's collection in a glass negative, but you can still see that sort of octagonal shape to the entire building and the sort of cupola up on top. So you can see it's changed quite a bit, but again, it's a trolley barn at this point. Okay, so the fire is spreading to the east and to the south. What do you think it comes across first? Well, it comes across, you know, Main Street, right, corner of Main and Broadway. It's starting to consume that stuff. But look what you got down just around the corner there, the First Baptist Church, right, and Van Houten Street and Washington Street. And what's sticking up with this gigantic wooden steeple? Okay, it's a collector of embers, because that's how conflagration spread. Radiant heat, that's the kind of heat you feel from a fireplace. You can't see it, but you can feel it. It's radiant heat. But the other big one is embers. And these embers were the size of baseball bats in a lot of cases. So this steeple is being pelted with embers, and it catches on fire. And it's the first major building to go up in flames, basically. It burns from the top down for all intents and purposes. To the right of that building is the original school number 1, built in the 1850s. 1902, it is the Paterson High School. Paterson only had one high school then. That was it, right there with its own little cupola on top. That goes down in flames. So the fire jumps Main Street, starts working its way down Broadway, the back side of Broadway, I guess you could say the southern side of Broadway, Van Houten Street. Everything on Van Houten Street's in its path at this point. So it's going down Van Houten. And of course, the other thing, as I said, it's going south as well. So it's moving its way down Main Street and taking out buildings there as well, one after another. We're calling for help. All the fire engines in Paterson are active. They're hooked up to hydrants. They're trying to put streams to essentially, we say, protect exposures, buildings that are exposed to fire, try to stop the fire in its tracks. It's an impossible task. Along comes the city of Passaic, volunteer fire department, Passaic. They show up with their steam engine, horse-drawn. Chief's gig driver goes to meet them in Lakeview with a fresh pair of horses. Because again, there's no Route 20, 21, 80, 46. None of that stuff exists, right? So it's all basically dirt roads and not great roads back then. So he meets this team of horses with the Passaic engine. They switch them out and they come racing down Main Street from the south, and they show up downtown. What happens? Apparently, John Fitzenmeyer, the driver of that engine, they hit something in the street. It throws him off the engine. Now he's the only guy on the steam engine sitting up in the seat with the horses, basically, and so he loses the reins going off, and so now we got a steam fire engine running with horses with no firefighter in it. Okay, fortunately, the engine kept going all the way down toward the fire, toward Broadway, and some Paterson firemen saw this happening, and they're somehow able to stop the horses and stop what was going on. Passaic their firefighters end up working down by the high school, that area basically. Again, where we're seeing in this photograph right now. Now we're going to switch back and forth between like burnt area and non-burnt area because it's easier for me to describe things a little bit. So you can see, again, the fire's coming from the left. If you look right in the sort of left center top, you see that square with the hole in it. That's what's left of the First Baptist Church. Is nothing other than the bricks that are left. All those other buildings in the foreground here, of course, are all destroyed. Now, this photograph was taken probably a week or two after the fire because you can see a construction shed across the street from City Hall there on the right. But all those buildings, the YMCA, all the commercial, Meyer Brothers, all those buildings are all gone up in flames. Again, this sector around Washington, Van Houten, Ellison Street, that area, and Main Street. This is another building that's destroyed. This is the corner. The other to the left is City Hall. This would be the southwest corner of Washington and Ellison Street. The reason I put in here is just in the story in the book we talk about an individual who, and again, think about it in your mind now. Big fire. people in the 19th century know fire. They fear fire more than they do criminals. Okay. When fire comes along, the first thing they're thinking about, save my property, meaning money and goods, right? So there's a man running around inside this building as it's burning, basically. I had to rescue him out of there. It saved him. Another unfortunate sightseer from Spring Street in South Paterson comes up to watch the fire. He's a couple blocks down to the west. He gets trapped between two burning buildings, and he's burned to death in the street. So those are the only two fatalities. Mary Brown, and I forgot his name. The two of them were the only two fatalities that we're aware of. Some people did actually get sick being outdoors during the fire, and they died a few weeks later. But the actual, during the fire itself, those are the two fatalities. So again, there's a lot of crazy things going on. You know, and again, but think about this too. This is the business district of Paterson. This is where all the commercial operations are, the banks, the stores and that kind of stuff. What this isn't is the residential district, and it's also not the mill districts. Okay, that's another important point here. Okay, on Norwood paint store, that went up, as you can imagine, pretty quickly. It's all paints and lacquers and thinners and stuff. Just to give you a sense of what these buildings look like. Here's number 3 survivor to the fire, Paterson Savings Institution. Look to the left of that building. This is the famous Main and Market corner, right? At an angle there, there's City Hall in the back. That building is still there to this day. And it's there for one reason. A, it's concrete and stone. B, there's no windows for the most part facing the other way, okay? Meaning facing away from the camera here, facing the north side of that. So when there's no windows, there's no ability for the fire to penetrate the exterior skin of the building. So it survives. And it's, again, it's still there to this day. So one of the 5 big buildings to survive the fire that was in the path of the fire. Can we argue that this building saves the rest of the southern toward the south on Main Street? You could argue that's exactly what it does. This building stops the progression of the fire, because remember, the fire is coming from the left and going to behind this building. This building is essentially a fire break. It does help stop the southern progression of the fire, again, along Main Street. Here's poor City Hall, gutted. Only one room survives in that building. Why? No one to this day knows why. But what's notable about this building, again, was built for the centennial in 1892. It's 1902. It's only 10 years old. What's notable about it is they used limestone from Indiana limestone. Indiana limestone is a very soft stone. It does not behave well with fire, okay, when it's heated. Certain stones like concrete is not stone, but it's something that responds very well to a fire. But a lot of regular like marble and things like that are actually a little bit better than this. This Indiana limestone, a lot of it had to be replaced because literally it effectively melted. If you look at some, not in this particular picture, you look at some pictures close up, it's almost as if the stone actually melted during the heat of the fire, basically. So this is, again, a survivor because it's still there to this day, but heavily damaged. Okay, there's the library. We got in the streets at this point. We've got, and again, this is a little bit, I'm sort of jumping ahead here a little bit, but just note the militia that are on the streets here. The militia coming out of the armory over on Market and Pennington. Okay, they came down, New Jersey National Guard, to protect the property, a lot of the people, because that was one of the big fears in any major conflagration is looting. It happens in every disaster. Looting happens all the time. It may be a little bit, it may be a lot, but there's always a chance of it happening. So that's why we deploy military and police to protect it. And again, that's the, what you're looking at above the man with the top hat in the center there. That is the corner of the library we saw earlier. Okay, now, the biggest tactical error of the fire, keep an eye on time here. The biggest tactical error was the fact that Gilmore and Mills were so focused on trying to contain the fire downtown, they don't realize these embers are flying through the air in these 40, 50 mile an hour winds and landing on Sandy Hill, Straight, Market, Park, that whole area over there. There's embers flying all over the place. And the very first building to go up in flames is McIntosh's drugstore. Now, the little quick story about that, McIntosh's drugstore, Park and Straight, is ignited by, on the roof, is ignited one of these embers. They see the fire burning. There's no firefighters around, okay? They see the fire, but who's there but the infamous Nathan Barnard. Nathan is on his way home to the old, where the library is today, basically. He's on his way home. He sees the fire. He tries to lend a hand. He literally goes into the building which many people did, they start emptying out the contents and trying to find a cart to get it the heck away from the fire. Poor Nathan Barnett works his fingers literally to the bone trying to make that happen. He gets home after that. He's exhausted. He's full of soot and everything else. He looks at his ring that Miriam Barnard had given to him. That's who the Barnard Memorial Hospital is named after her. He looks at his ring and it's missing, I think, off the top of my head, 2 of the 3 diamonds that were in that ring are now gone. They're still probably there on Park and Straight under the debris pile there. So sad story for him. But this is important now because this is a second leg to the fire that, for all intents and purposes, is left to the Newark Fire Department to deal with, okay? Because Newark eventually gets there. Now, by the way, quickly, think about this. This is not going in, sitting in a firehouse, pushing a button, start, engine, go, and drive. This is getting horses, steamer to the rail yards, getting a several thousand-pound steam engine up a ramp onto a flat car, securing it, and then sending it by train there. So it took hours and hours to do this. One of the Jersey City engines fell off of the ramp as they were putting it up. And I don't know how much damage was done, but it wasn't good. So anyway, Newark is, when they get there, stationed in the Sandy Hill area. They're pretty much on a Market, a couple blocks off a Straight to the east. Okay, that's kind of where they're centered. That's where they're operating. So they're the ones essentially dealing with the Sandy Hill fire. Okay, who else is helping here? Thank God for the mills. Benjamin Eastwood, the Paragon Mill, Morton and Straight, where my great-grandfather worked. They all had fire brigades and they all had working firefighting equipment, including fire pumps with hose. They formed a perimeter along the backside of Market Street to keep the fire from going down Straight Street, basically, to this, again, to the south and to the east. So they provide a barrier. They are critical to stopping the fire in the Sandy Hill neighborhood, basically. Them, Newark, and again, the cemeteries. Those are the critical 3 pieces that come together because, again, the Paterson Fire Department is out of resources, can help. This is Doherty and Wadsworth is no longer there. A couple blocks in, they had their fire brigade working. The only mills that actually were impacted was the Alfred Crew Mill, which is to the right of this, sort of to the east. They had some damage, not a lot. But what's the key point about this, the takeaway? Think, some of you may have seen the news, 3 or 4 days ago, a gigantic QVC warehouse in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, burns to the ground. The whole building goes to burn to the ground. 2,000 people were employed in that factory or that warehouse for the goods that they sell through, through the TV channel, the QVC channel and stuff. Those people are out of a job now. Okay. The only silver lining, perhaps you could say, about the Paterson fire was that none of the factories were really affected to any extent, really. The businesses certainly downtown were, the banks certainly were, but the mills themselves that so many people worked in, thank God, none of them succumbed to the fire. Here's a picture of a steam-driven fire pump. They call them the underwriter's pump. That was used in many of these buildings. Here's the Nathan. We talked about him. We thank him for his service to the city. He's a guy with a statue out front of City Hall, of course. He's the guy, by the way, who says, I have Barnard Temple there on Broadway, right? He's a very high in the Jewish hierarchy in Paterson. He says any church, there's 5 churches that are consumed in the fire for all intents and purposes. 5 congregations are without a home. He says, come to the temple, we'll give you a home. Okay, that's the kind of pull togetherness that Paterson had back then. Okay. Now we're standing in that same cemetery, looking the other way, looking to the west. Do you see any houses there? None, 0. Why? Wood. Wood is not good when it comes to conflagration. Simple as that, right? There's nothing left there. School 15 on the left is completely gone. Okay, those are mostly houses that you see in most of the photograph here. And again, you see a couple of tombstones there in the corner. This is that Sandy Hill cemetery I was talking to you about before. But here's Gilmore. Gilmore gets injured during the fire. So we only have 2 chiefs. He's gone in a backdraft, actually at McIntosh's. He gets taken out with that. So he's carried off the field, basically. So it's poor Mills is dealing with the whole thing, essentially with John Stag. I am sure it's not written down anywhere, but I'm sure John Mills walked up Van Houten Street, went to John Stag and said, "This is what I'm doing. What do you think?" And he said, "Up, up, up, up." And then he went back again, back and forth. I'm sure that's what he did because Stag was right next to the fire. Thank God his house didn't go up. Another shot from Straight Street, looking sort of the opposite we just saw here. In the very center in the foreground, of course, is the Catholic Church on Market Street there. And it was consumed. It was having a service during the fire. And an individual came in and said, "Hey, the fire is spreading this way. You better get the heck out." So the priest who was in charge, basically, as noted, in an orderly fashion, told people to go out the back door away from the fire. So perhaps he saved a bunch of lives by doing that. Remember I told you about people protecting their stuff? Look at that pile of personal effects there. This is 16th Avenue. All those homes are still there. Most of the parks, most of the cemeteries after the fire were the collection points for people's goods. So once they got organized, they said, "Okay, I'm going to move to Aunt Frank's house on Hazel Street or whatever, or Uncle Frank's house on Hazel Street, then fine, we'll take our stuff." But this is what it looked like right after the fire. And because you can see snow, the snow came a few days later. Park Avenue, Baptist Church. Okay, that's what's left of that one. Again, 5 churches go up in flames. I have this picture in here because supposedly dynamite was used during the fire in the corner of Carroll and Park. And this is supposedly where it happened. Now, dynamite in the wrong hands can do more damage by starting more fires than stopping them, okay? We learned that in San Francisco, particularly if you use black powder. So I don't think it's still an issue, but I ask you to do this tonight. Before you go to bed tonight, pull your fire insurance policy, get out the fine print, okay, really tiny, like the 30 pages of that stuff. Buried in there is a relief of not having to pay your policy if, in fact, your house is destroyed by the civil authorities, meaning the fire department blowing it up to stop a conflagration. It's still in insurance policies to this day, okay? So take a look for it. Again, there's St. Joseph's Church again, the Catholic Church, again, cemetery on the right. Okay, so we're going to go through the ruins. Here's where the fire started. That's what's left of the wigwam, not much. The building to the right is damaged, but the fire does not spread to the west from this point. It's all to the east. There's First Baptist, again, minus the chimney. Not much left of the high school next door. This is looking from the south to the north. There's Second National, Paterson National Bank, of course, City Hall. Hamilton Club on the right. The Hamilton Club is gutted, okay? Jersey City's fire department was stationed there in that portion of the fire. There's a notation I found where one of the lion's heads fell off the side of the building, and the Jersey City firefighters took it back to their firehouse as a souvenir. It has never been seen again. So it may be in the basement of some firehouse in Jersey City right now. We don't know. Presbyterian Church. Here's a photo called "Cooling Off the Safes." And by the way, in that background, remember I told you earlier about P. Colts House? Take a look. There's the only standing wall, basically, with the 2 chimneys. That's all left of the old City Hall, Peter Colts house. This guy with the water stream trying to cool the safes off, because after the fire, there was so many advertisements on how well the different types of safes performed, whether or not there was still paper inside, or did they open the door too quickly and they get this flash of flame and there's just ashes inside. Again, Park Avenue here. It's nothing vertical here, nothing, okay, because it's all wood. This survived. This is just a little artifact I got. This is a letter to an attorney from Red Bank for an individual who was apparently had something to do, as I recall, with stealing something from Quackenbush's. And what's notable about it is it's literally like right before the fire. So in the courthouse. Now the courthouse did in fact survive the fire because it was further to the south, but a lot of the lawyers' offices were consumed, this, including Nelson, I mentioned before, he was a lawyer. So many other law offices were consumed. And so this case and this paperwork, maybe this is the only surviving thing for Peter Quackenbush. I think it's Peter Quackenbush. No, I'm sorry, the Quackenbush firm, but I'm trying to forget the guy's name who was involved with this. Oh, Mr. Whedon, okay? So anyway, again, there's little artifacts here, but paperwork-wise, the health department suffered, the city hall suffered. Most importantly, the tax records they thought were completely lost. Can you imagine that? the city saying, okay, did you pay your taxes? Oh yeah, I paid my taxes. How do you prove it, right? They found somehow, I don't know why, but they were the early days of backup, like on computers, right? Somebody had a second set over at the county courthouse, and they're able to use that to rebuild their tax record. Here's John and his two brothers. This photograph I found on eBay for 12 bucks, and nobody knew who it was. It's not in the greatest shape, but the photo I used in the book, the guy who did the layout for the book also digitally enhanced this. But what's really funny about it is that they, of course, were brewers. And if you get a magnifying glass out to those glasses, he's got, looks like a mug of beer with a head on it. If you take your magnifying glass, look really closely, there's liquid in there, but it's balls of cotton on top. So it's just because the photo lasts long enough with that head to get the picture and everything. But I think it's a wonderful picture of the Hinchcliffes. Most important thing about Hinchcliffe is what? He is on top of things. He's making sure that city responds quickly to this. And of course, his famous sayings, we will take care of our own, basically. Here's a couple police officers and the militiamen over there by the library. Here's the armory where all the military were placed, basically. This also became housing for some people for a few weeks after the fire. And then this could be Jack Stefano sitting on Monument Hill there, looking, thinking, what's going to happen to Paterson now? It's still smoking. Are we going to come back? And of course they did. And of course, this is John Hinchcliffe building the city back himself. This is the best cartoon ever. He's got his scarf on, he's got his overalls on, and it says Mayor Hinchcliffe on his trowel, and he's literally building back the city himself, taking care of things. The wonderful image there. City Hall starts to be rebuilt. Of course, thing was only 10 years old, right? We start using other buildings that are still surviving downtown, like public service, electric and gas ends up in this building for a while. What else is going on? Well, let's take a couple minutes. It's about, we're going about an hour now, so we're almost wrapped up here. What else is going on? Well, again, I mentioned to you before that the workers themselves were benefited that the fire did not take out any of the factory jobs that the city had, which was the majority of jobs in the city. Of course, it took away the jobs of the commercial business people, but as far as the factory workers, it did not. What's going on in Paterson at the time, again, remember I told you they doubled in population in just 20 years. And there's a high number of immigrants coming in. And of course, as it is today, typically the newer immigrants get the lousier jobs, right? And probably the worst job of all is the silk dyeing guys who were literally putting their hands in hot, nasty liquids involving acids and things for the dyeing industry. And they're not being paid very well. I mean, there's no minimum wage. None of that stuff exists, of course. And so Paterson is a ripe place for people who have socialist bendings, basically. People who would like to see the worker certainly paid a lot better, the worker to be elevated to a position perhaps with the factory owners and things. And so it is a place where socialism is working in the city through political means. The politicians, some of you know that the Haledon's mayor for a while was a socialist, basically. What's also happening is the anarchist movement has a home in Paterson at this point. Luigi Galliani, there he is, Luigi Galliani, this time editor of La Question Sociale, right, the social question, is living on I think it was Morton or Oak Street, his house, but his business is on Market, his newspaper is on Market, and it gets burnt up in the fire. And he's constantly keeping a few heads of the police and the federal government. Teddy Roosevelt is president at this point. Teddy actually, thank God for Garrett Hobart, right? For Teddy Roosevelt, right? Paterson's own vice president, right? So maybe Teddy's paying back something to Garrett, who died in '99, in the sense that he shuts down the La Question Sociale of being able to use the U.S. mails to mail their newspapers. So there's a lot of that stuff going on. And so as Paterson sort of emerges from fire, again, still during wintertime, what do you think the worst thing could happen to Paterson? They get hit with another disaster. They get hit with a gigantic flood in March, which ironically, if you looked at a map of the two, the fire is pretty much the downtown area. up to Broadway. So Broadway to the north is sort of like the stopping point that doesn't go that way. But guess what? The floods come right out of River, right up River Street, right up to Broadway. So literally the area that was not affected by the fire is right next to the fire literally a month later. And so it's just another disaster where we got to get the National Guard involved again and the Armory for housing. People aren't particularly happy. By the summer, there's a lot of agitation in the silk workers industry, the silk workers themselves. And so we get a strike in June of '02 involving workers, and the anarchists are playing a big role with that. They're firing them up and stuff. They're marching all over the place. And what ends up happening, of course, is that the police end up having to sort of take over and sort of get control of the streets again. And here's, of course, a picture of the patrol wagon, which would have been from that time period. Here's Chief Grawl. Mayor Hinchcliffe orders Grawl to buy up every firearm in the city of Paterson. Says, here's a check, buy every gun you can find in Paterson and secure them, because they were worried that gun stores would start being emptied out, basically. Grawl does exactly that, and he walks off the job. He refuses to sort of play hardball with the striking workers, basically. So there's some there, and for those of you who are familiar with the 1913 strike, his number 2 in command is John Bimson, who was the chief in 13. So, and Bimson is known to be a more aggressive police chief, let's put it that way. So Grawl is sort of tries to walk a fine line with the mayor, tell him, look, get control of the streets, get these guns and everything else, and not be aggressive as much against the workers. That was going on as well with this. You know what? Here's the deal. People had the thought that Paterson would survive. The resources were in Paterson to rebuild. They had the money, the banks had the money, and so money started flowing pretty quickly, particularly the summer and the next few years, basically, to rebuild Paterson. Of course, here's Quackenbush's store, much grander store than they had before. Here's Meyer Brothers, which of course burned its own fire back in the 90s and unfortunately killed a firefighter in that building to the left. That's Meyer Brothers. Here's the Hamilton Club rebuilt. Essentially the same shell. It was by the way, that was number 5 survivor. The shell of the Hamilton Club was still there, so they just rebuilt it basically. Here's again your Paterson Savings Institution with the new building next to it. Okay, as you can see some empty lots there. They're still being built. This is a few years after the fire. And again, look, see how these are all like photos taken in the first year or two. You could see these piles of dirt and stuff. These are still going up. That's the Paterson News Building. Couple famous issues about the buildings themselves. Carrere and Hastings, most famous for design New York Public Library. They're the ones who design or involved with City Hall's rebuilding and City Hall itself. Wentworth, some of you are familiar with the architect, sort of a local architect. He does dozens of buildings around Paterson after the fire, basically. John Ferguson, the contractor, who I've learned a lot about in the last few years. John Ferguson was this incredible individual who was very involved with Paterson, loved Paterson, was just like any other contractor, started off small, understood one big thing. He understood the value of reinforced concrete. He gets into reinforced concrete so quickly that it becomes his predominant material of choice for building very large buildings all up and down the East Coast. And as Mayor Kramer pointed out to me, in Bermuda. So Mayor Kramer's father's supply company supplied John Ferguson. John Ferguson built several hotels and bank buildings in Bermuda. He was smart, and Pat Kramer told me this. What he did is he put a bid in, he got the bid, he got the job done on time, but under budget. He returned the money back to the building owner and said, I didn't need this much money here. What do you think happened after that? He got contracts coming in all over the place. Okay, so because he was an honest guy who built a really good building. I mean, he built, of course, the Fabian Theater, Alexander Hamilton Hotel, list goes on and on. But Ferguson, by the way, is somebody we're going to have a lecture about going forward on Ed Smike series, because it is a very interesting story. And we've recently uncovered lots of photo negatives of many of his buildings that were taken at the time that were YMCA and all of them. This is the First National Bank replacement. I don't like it. I like the old one with the statues on. That's a much more, the other one's a much more attractive building. Who's that out front? But yes, Hobart. Okay, Garrett Hobart. statue in front of City Hall. It's sort of a closure to the fire to a great extent that we get the statue here. Alexander Hamilton's statue, by the way, was supposed to go in front of City Hall not too long before the fire. Thank God it did not arrive in time. And of course, you know, it's sitting on its precipice over at the falls. So anyway, that is a story of the Paterson Fire. There's John Hinchcliffe saying thank you. And I will take this off a share screen. Stop share. Okay. So there we go. Okay, so any Q&A here yet? No? Let's see. On the chat room, let's check the chat room. Okay, no questions yet. So if anybody's got a question, just throw them into the chat room right now, if you have any. And we'll try to answer them and stuff. So I think we got you in just over an hour. So you dealt with 2 days of fire. The fire actually burned for 2 days. So smoldering ruins. And by the way, just like John Stag did, many fire chiefs from around the region literally took a train ride to Paterson after the fire to learn lessons, as did John Damrell of the Boston Fire Department in 1871. He went all the way to Chicago to see the Chicago fire. He looks around, he says, oh my God, I got a lot of the same problems. I got to go back home. He tells the city council in Boston, hey, we need better equipment. We need better stuff. And they ignore him. And in 1872, the Great Boston Fire happens. Down where Filene's building is, that used to be there, Washington Street in Boston. Paterson's Fire Department gets brand new equipment after this. One of those steamers actually exists to this day in the Wyckoff Fire Department. It was bought by same brand quarries many years ago, used to pump out water. And Sam Brand was a member of the Wyckoff Fire Department, gave it to the fire department where it still is to this day. And if we had our wherewithal back in 2002, Jack would have been up on the seat of that steamer riding. The plan was to actually have that steamer with horses during the commemoration in February 9th, 2002, to have it come unannounced from around the corner in front of the Alexander Hamilton Hotel and start clopping up Market Street. And to the astonishment of everybody that was there, only a handful of us were going to try to do that. I had the Wyckoff Fire Department all lined up, and I got turned down by City Hall. They wouldn't let me do it. So anyway, so that was the story of that. But the Paterson Fire Department eventually goes to a 2-platoon system. They, you know, again, during this fire, if you were in the Paterson Fire Department in 1902, you effectively got 3 hours off a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You went home to your house, which is only a few blocks away. You could not be married in a house that was in Elmwood Park or East Paterson. It had to be within blocks. And you only got a few days off a month. It was a 1-platoon system. We don't get 2 platoons until basically World War I, and then 3, eventually, then 4 platoons. So there might be a question here. Yeah, question?
Yeah, there is a question in the Q&A.
Yes. So the Royal Factory was not affected, thank goodness. They're a little bit further down, and you can thank Benjamin Eastwood and his folks and the Paragon Mill for saving Royal, because Royal's a little bit further down the block. Unfortunately, as you know, fire didn't take out Royal, but a demolition crew did. It was a sad day, right? No, Grand Street, no, it never made it that far. So only to the south, it only made it effectively along the Market Street edge. That's pretty much it. It did a little bit past that in certain areas, but Market Street was the southern edge of the fire, basically. So Royal, the Royal Mill was saved, thank God. And he's back in the news again. We recently on eBay, some of you may have seen them. There's a whole bunch of Royal's own photographs. Royal was a well-known amateur photographer, but really kind of a professional photographer at that, who took pictures a lot of downtown buildings along with John Reed, of course, and Doremus, the two big ones. But Royal's photographs, his personal photographs, a bunch of them just showed up on eBay. I bought some of them. So I think we're going to do a talk about him as well at some point, because again, he was a famous guy who invented the routing machine. Yes, Dennis, actually, one thing I didn't mention here is that, I did the book on this, but you can see it here. Here's the new version of it. It's called Reissued. Right? Where's my reissued thing here? It's reissued. here's the original version of the book. In the original version, Dennis, is a map that I did. I copied from the Sanborn Company. So Sanborn did a map of the fire. The problem was it was two different maps. So I tried to string them together with the railroad, Ramapo Avenue, and all those missing streets that were in there. I did the best I could with my friend. It's not perfect. It's probably about 93% perfect, but it's close enough to give you a sense. So if you look, all the colored buildings are different types of construction, but look, there's one fire, then there's a second fire. It's two different fires, really, spaced between by the railroad tracks of maybe 4 or 5 blocks that were totally untouched. But again, it was all embers flying over the top. So, okay, let's see. Do we get any more here? Maps. Okay. Where can you get the book? All right, Bill. Here's the problem, Bill. 2 of my sales locations where we were selling the book, because I printed 500. So if you have an original one, there are 500 roughly of these books printed. The new ones, the reissued ones, which I identify that way, I do them when I need to do them. The problem, Bill, is that both the National Park bookstore is now a maintenance shop until they get the new visitor center open a couple of years. And of course, Lambert Castle is closed now too, which was my other location. So Bill, if you go online and you look me up in in John Jay College, if you shoot me an email, we can talk offline. I mean, matter of fact, let me just type, actually, let me type it in here. Let me see if I can, I'm going to type my email address in here. If anyone is interested in the book, we'll try to work out a way to get it to you. I just got to reprint some more. I do them in small bunches.
Glenn, there's also one more question in the Q&A section.
Yep. Now let me get this out. Make sure I get this right. Glenn Corbett. No, I got missing something here. Glenn Corbett. Hard to see this thing here. I'll get that question 1 second here. Okay, Glenn Corbett at optonline.net. Looks good. All right, so I'm going to send this out. That's my email address. So if you want to send me an email, we'll try to get a copy to you. I just have to get them reprinted, so it may take a little while, but they typically cost $20 each. And then, like I said, we got to figure out shipping or where I could even leave it at the museum for you or something like that. So that will work out as well. So Joe wants to know, with the trolley barn where the current Salvation Army building is, and where Edison's electric plant. Actually, it's close, Joe. It's actually over, if you know where the Star of Hope building, it was right there where that is. And actually, the better solution is the Broadway bus terminal. That was the trolley barn's location. And so the trolley barn, of course, was a trolley company. The trolley company was eventually sold to Public Service, right? The Public Service started as a sort of, we know it's a gas and electric company, but they had lots of trolley companies. So that's why that's there. There's a gigantic electrical substation there too, because they've owned it for over 100 years now. So that's where it was. It's really where the bus terminal is and the Star of Hope mission that's right next door there on Lower Broadway, across from Mulberry Street. That's basically where it is. And I think in the works right now, I'm working with the Paterson Historic Preservation Officer, Gianfranco Archimedes, who we may be putting up a sign there for where the fire started, in a little narrative, a couple 100-word narrative, and maybe a few photos and stuff to identify to people where the fire actually started. So that is that. Okay. Any other questions while we've got people out there? Like I said, as you can imagine, I can go on for days with this. Okay, listen, I've kept you for over an hour now. I hope you get a little sense of the fire. Maybe you can smell a little bit of the smoke, you know, and get a, you know, kind of understand what this is all about. But again, oh, I didn't mention 451 buildings. That's how many buildings were involved here. There's nothing in New Jersey's history that compares to it. The closest I get is Newark in the 1840s and Atlantic City. Atlantic City, Wood and Atlantic City don't go along together, okay? Wood hotels, gigantic wood hotels, all burnt up very easily, okay? So, anyway, so that's the deal. That's the deal. So, anyway, I guess we're done with questions. Any last ones? No? Okay. So again, just remember, if you're interested in any of our other sessions and stuff, we'll be having them Again, coming up on January 13th, the Colt Revolver, the Dime Mansion Part 2. January 27th will be Tim Crane, with both of those with Ed Smike. And then January 18th, we'll have the Colt Revolver, and February 15th, we'll have Minerva Miller's story. So thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you, Dennis. And I hope, like I said, if we'll see you at the museum soon. Jack, any parting comments from the museum?
Well, I was going to say, she did mention the library. The name that alluded
the library.
Mary Ryle.
Mary Ryle, thank you.
That the Mary Danforth Ryle. She gave her father's home, which was Charles Danforth. She actually gave that donation in 1888. As you said, the first free public library is the Paterson one, which was established in 1885. In 1900, and she really gave all the money to, renovate it to make it a library. And then in 1901, she literally doubled the size of the place, but only lasted 9 months before, sadly, the fire took it all out. But there were about 3,000 books that were out on loan, and that became the nucleus for the Paterson Library's resurrection. And they set up about 265 Broadway, just up from where they're, they would relocate.
And sad part of it was a lot of the bound newspapers, the early stuff went up in flames with that fire as well. But I should just tell you something quick about the library. So the library is, to some extent, the lovely building we have today, is a beneficiary of the fire, right? So, and of course, many of you know that Henry Bacon, who designed the Lincoln Memorial, was the same architect who designed the Paterson Library. It's a miniature version of Lincoln Memorial. Instead of Plato and Socrates on the Paterson Library, it's the States of America.
It's the other way around. Our building's built in 1903 by him. It's 1922 that the Lincoln Memorial, so.
Okay, I stand corrected. You're right. Ours is early, so he copied our building for the Lincoln Memorial.
Now you got it.
Well, thank you all. Huh? Go ahead, Jack.
Glenn, I just wanted to say thank you for the great presentation on the Great Paterson Fire of 1902.
Thank you.
It was wonderful. Thank you, Glenn.
Thanks, guys. So we'll see you all soon on the next one. Very good.